Evening, everybody. What is that beeping? I don't know what it is. It's so weird. I didn't plan it. I swear I didn't plan it. It's not some like. And now the big reveal. Thank you, John, for choosing all of those songs. They just tie in so well. I feel like I could probably just sit back down again. But let's not. Let's play a game of word association. So I'm going to say a word, and you can say, or you can think in your head, whichever one you want. You can call it out aloud if you want. I'll say a word, you say the word that comes to mind. Are you ready? I've got 4. Dairy. Pitchfork. Birthday. Mark. Is it his birthday? Okay, we're gonna have to do something about that later. Holy Spirit. Oh, Ruach, fire. Okay, I seem to have done an accidental series on the Spirit. It wasn't really what I set out to do, but I don't know, one sermon just seemed to keep leading to another, and I look back and I think, wow, I've been talking about this for about 4 weeks. So several weeks ago we looked at the Spirit with the uppercase S and Spirit with the lowercase s, and how sometimes, especially in the writings of Paul, sometimes it's hard to tell which one Paul is talking about. And it's as if Paul thinks that God's Spirit and our spirit are so closely entwined that it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. And then we found out about the Ruach. You have to sort of spit a little bit, but maybe Methero doesn't want that on the microphone, I don't know. But the word that gets translated as spirit, from Ruach in the Hebrew and pneuma in the Greek, can also be translated as wind or as breath. Because people in the ancient world didn't see that these 3 words were 3 completely different things. They were more like 3 aspects of the same thing. And so when an ancient person looked out and saw the wind in the trees, just as John said, or the wind on their face, it was a reminder that God is the one who gives you breath. God is the one who enlivens the world, infuses the world, and it's God's Spirit that gives life. And since God's Spirit is a life-giving Spirit, we can reflect on our lives and ask, what is it that brought me life today? And we talked about the examine, and some people gave that a go. The spiritual practice that St. Ignatius of Loyola came up with. And then 2 weeks ago we looked at that really strange passage in Ezekiel with the dry bones joining back together like some sort of zombie movie. But then the dry bones joined together and flesh appeared on them, and then they were enlivened by the Ruach, spirit, breath, wind of God. And that passage was originally speaking to the Jewish exiles who had been forcibly taken to a foreign country and who felt like they'd been abandoned by God because they'd been exiled. And it still speaks to anyone who feels like they've been exiled, all those who have ever said, our bones are dry, our hope has perished, we are cut off, just like the exiles said. And that passage with the dry bones coming together pictured life being breathed into the dry bones or into the corpses. And that passage insists that there's always hope, that God can bring life to the driest of lives, that no situation is too hopeless for God to turn around. So as I said, it was sort of an accidental sermon series, but Christmas is coming, and so we have to move on next week. But I didn't want to leave the Spirit behind without addressing the topic of the Holy Spirit. And I have to say that I've been consciously avoiding using the term Holy Spirit for the last 4 weeks because there is so much baggage connected to those 2 words when you put them together. And I wonder what your word association answer was. Whether the words Holy Spirit, whether they evoke a positive, kind of warm reaction in you, or whether they evoke, I don't know, something akin to running, screaming from the building. I'm old enough to remember 1994 when the Toronto Blessing hit the news. Has anyone heard of that? Yes? Yes, all the people, yeah. But I see some younger people nodding as well. The Toronto Blessing. There were reports that there was this movement of the Spirit that was happening at this church at Toronto, the airport church of something or other. People were experiencing in that congregation this overwhelming sense of joy. They were overcome with uncontrollable laughter. They were twitching and writhing on the ground. And this movement then spread to other churches around the world. And some churches and church leaders denounced it as a work of the devil or fake, and others just longed for it to happen in their church. Well, I remember being perplexed and confused and had no idea what to make of it. Was this a real phenomena of the Spirit? Were people just faking this stuff? Was it social contagion? I was sceptical. That's who I am. I'm a sceptical person. It just seemed weird. And I'd had previous experiences with a Pentecostal church that made me wary of grand claims about how the Spirit works. But I was also sceptical of the skeptics, who seemed very eager to denounce anything that was outside of their own experience and outside of their own control as demonic or fake. I've never experienced any of those phenomena, even though I've sought them out at various times in my life. But I know people, trusted friends that I have, who have experienced some of that phenomena. And I've no reason to doubt their stories that they've told me. I'm friends with a heterosexual couple. I know. I'm not just, this is, not my whole life. And they had given up on ever falling pregnant. Am I going red now? I feel it. Yeah, we'll see how we go by the end of this. Anyway, I'm friends with this couple. You'll see why they need to be heterosexual. They had given up on ever falling pregnant, and they were about to embark on this long process of adoption. They visited this charismatic church, a little small charismatic church, and the speaker, without knowing them, without knowing anything of their situation, went over to the wife and said, "You think you're barren, but you're not." And the next week, she took a pregnancy test, and she was pregnant. Now, this isn't something I read in a book. These are people that I know. A church leader I knew a very long time ago was the least charismatic person you could ever imagine. And he told me one day, he was out in his garden one day doing some gardening, and he suddenly started speaking in tongues. He had no idea what was happening. He had no idea what to make of it. He never subsequently tried speaking in tongues because it wasn't something he was comfortable with. But it had happened. I had no reason to disbelieve him. A woman I knew in California became convinced after reading Genesis that she had dominion over all the animals. And so she experimented with telling her daughter's hamster what to do. She said the hamster ignored her completely. I don't doubt that. But this same woman prayed for me one day, and her prayer impacted me quite deeply. I know people who were deeply involved in the charismatic movement in years past, speaking in tongues, claiming to have seen all sorts of miraculous things, and now they're cynical atheists and who wouldn't walk into a church if you paid them. So what do you do with all of that? I told you in my very first sermon, if you were here back just over 2 years ago, that I apologise in advance for not having all of the answers. This is one of those sermons. There's a guy called Gordon Fee. He's a Pentecostal biblical scholar. Interesting guy. Those two didn't used to go together at all. They're starting to come together a bit more now, which is a good thing. But he was one of my favourite scholars, biblical scholars. He died last year. He did most of his academic work when it was really unusual to be academic and a Pentecostal. And he was told by his Pentecostal mentors, you can be a preacher on fire or you can be an academic on ice. He decided to be an academic on fire. He once studied in depth every reference to the Spirit in Paul's letters, and he wrote a very thick and heavy book. I meant to bring it tonight just to show you how thick and heavy it was, but I couldn't get it to my car because it was so heavy. It has lots of pages, I don't know, like 500 pages in this book, and there are lots of pages on every single reference to the Spirit in Paul. He did a very thorough job. He titled his book, God's Empowering Presence, because that summed up his conclusions of how Paul understood the Spirit. Each of those words in the title packs a punch. Each says something important about the Spirit. God's empowering presence. The Spirit is God. God is Spirit. The two can't be separated any more than you can separate a living person from their breath and the oxygen that flows through their veins. The Spirit is empowering. It's the thing that fuels life, that directs our ethics, that pushes us towards greater and greater love, that draws us closer to God and nudges us towards God's ways of living. The Spirit is God's presence with us, somehow entwined with ours. It's why nothing can separate us from the love of God. God is with you through the darkest of nights and the brightest of days. Well, Gordon Fee's book answered a lot of questions for me about how the Bible, especially Paul's letters, portrayed and understood the Spirit of God. But it didn't answer a lot of the questions that I had and still have when I look around at churches and see very unspirit-like things happening. It didn't answer my questions about the vastly different ways that I see people experiencing the Spirit of God. I remain confused, and I suspect I will be to my dying day. But there are some things that I feel confident about. Christians who have experienced strange spirit phenomena are not necessarily more or less spiritual than Christians who have not. I'm convinced of this. Having unusual spiritual gifts or unusual spiritual experiences is not a measure of Christian maturity. There aren't two classes of Christians, so beware of anyone who suggests that you must have some sort of particular experience in order to be spiritual. And if you don't believe me, go read 1 Corinthians again. So that's the first thing. Another thing is that I've become convinced of is that spiritual experiences cannot necessarily be explained via waterproof theology. Because I've heard different teachers explain the theology behind different spiritual manifestations in great detail, and their explanations are usually peppered with Bible verses, and yet different teachers come to different conclusions and sometimes have quite conflicting theologies. So John Wimber and the Vineyard Movement, if you're familiar with that, regard the purpose of signs and wonders as supporting the preaching of the gospel. He sees that in Acts. But then there are some Pentecostal teachers who connect the sign gifts with baptism in the Holy Spirit and teach that this baptism is not a part of a person's conversion to the Christian faith, but happens sometime after. If you haven't been in the church a long time, some of this is probably going completely over your head. And that is perhaps a good thing, I don't know. Gordon Fee, the Pentecostal biblical scholar that I mentioned earlier, found himself unwelcome in a number of Pentecostal churches because he challenged some of their long-held theology around the Holy Spirit while holding to other parts. It seems to me like maybe God does stuff without always giving a full explanation to his sales reps. I'm convinced that sometimes having unusual spiritual experiences change people's lives for the long haul. I know people who were deeply, deeply impacted by their charismatic experiences. Their damaged relationships were restored. They experienced healing, both physical and emotional. And sometimes when people look back on their experiences, they regard them as they weren't really authentic experiences of the Spirit, but a product of their own vulnerability combined with a manipulative setting of repetitive worship and a charismatic teacher. Strange things happen. There's no doubt about it. Weird, miraculous things happen in some places and some times. But if the Holy Spirit is the same Spirit that we found all the way through the Old Testament and into the New Testament, things we've been talking about over the last few weeks, if the Spirit is the same Spirit, the Holy Spirit is the same Spirit that pervades all of creation, that blows with the wind, that flows in and out of our lungs, then this Holy Spirit of God is in all places at all times. And there, he's there, she's there, in the silent, still moments of the night, there in the weeping that follows a great sadness, there in the blowing out of birthday candles, there in the joy of a good friendship and in the beauty of the wild blue sky. The Spirit of God can be found in the ordinary moments of life if we would only be present enough to notice her. I think it's helpful that Paul's language about the Spirit isn't particularly precise. Sometimes he simply uses the term Spirit, and as I said, sometimes you can't tell whether it's big S or little s. Sometimes he talks about the Spirit of God. Sometimes he refers to the Spirit of Christ. Sometimes the Spirit of Jesus. At other times he calls this Spirit the Holy Spirit. Paul doesn't make distinctions between them as if he's talking about three different entities, a Spirit of God, a Spirit of Christ, and the Holy Spirit. It's almost as if his language gives us three different ways to view the same thing. Or maybe three different ways to relate to this one thing. And I'm wondering if that might have implications for us tonight. For example, if you had deep and profound spiritual experiences in the Pentecostal church or other churches, if you get swept up in worship, if you feel like this Holy Spirit is someone that you can relate to positively and on a deeply personal level, then go for it. Maybe that's your way into connection with God, a relationship, a partnership with God. If, on the other hand, you feel scarred for life with your previous experiences with the Holy Spirit, and the word Holy Spirit triggers panic attacks, then maybe reflecting on the terminology Spirit of God might be helpful for you. The idea of this ancient, primordial, creative spirit that brought life to the world in the beginning, that brings order to chaos, that maintains and sustains the universe like Paul talks about in Colossians. Maybe that's an idea that resonates with you. God is the ground of being, the creative force that underlines all of existence, including you and your life. And go with that. Maybe that's the way to connect with God for you. Or maybe you're just very fond of Jesus. You read in the Gospels how he treated people, how he viewed the world, how he stood up to the bullies and showed compassion to the struggling, rejected ones. And he's your role model. the brother that you never had, the one who listens to and cares for you, the one that you walk with and talk with throughout the day. Maybe you relate more to the Spirit of Jesus. And go with that. It seems to me from the biblical text that these are all valid ways of connecting with God. So rather than closing the door on the Spirit because of past experiences, there are other options you could explore to connect with God, to connect with the Spirit, to discover or rediscover life in the Spirit. Because as we've read in Ezekiel, with his valley of the dry bones, and as we've read in Genesis, with its description of God breathing life into the dirt body of the human, and as we've read in Paul's letters about this life-giving Spirit, where the Spirit is, there is life. And where life is, where there's flourishing, joyous life, then surely the Spirit of God is blowing somewhere nearby.